whilst you might be divorcing as husband and wife, you're not divorcing as parents. You're never going to be able to do that.
Not waking up and seeing your children every day, Christmas, all these things, it's huge. You don't know what the future's going to look like.
It's never going to work, but we see it does work. It really, really can work, and there can be that moment of realisation whereby they stop and reflect, and it can make a change of direction in the co-parenting theme.
Do you want the autonomy to make decisions for your children, or do you want a complete stranger, a judge, to impose a decision on you that neither of you may like?
There's small steps, right? We can only start by taking one step. So take the first step. What is it that you can do today to make that long-term vision that you want for your children happen?
You want to do the best that you can to get through this situation so that you can get to a stage where your energy is being focused on living a good life, not being stuck in the fight.
Hello and welcome to this Owen Mitchell podcast. We're here to keep you up to date with legal and financial news that matters to you. My name is Zahra Pabani and I'm a partner here at Owen Mitchell. Thank you so much for joining this podcast. Stay tuned because over the next 2 episodes we're going to be talking to you about life after divorce and what that looks like in this day and age. We want to try and help you with this next chapter of your life to try and make it as empowering and fulfilling as possible. Today we're specifically going to be talking about co-parenting and what that looks like and feels like. We understand that the process of separation is really difficult. So joining me in this discussion today are 3 guests. Phil Rhodes, family law partner from Owen Mitchell, Joanna Gosling, former leading BBC journalist and now a family law mediator here at Owen Mitchell, and Marcie Shaoul, who is the chair and founder of the Co-Parent Way and the author of the co-parenting method. Thanks for joining me, and I'd like to start with you first, Marcie, if I may. I think one of the most difficult things that parents can face during divorce and in their journey after divorce is the fact that the realisation that you're not going to wake up with your children every day, that your children are going to be in 2 separate houses, and even if your children are away from you a night, 2 nights, half the week, it doesn't matter how much time it is, that feeling can be incredibly intense. Now, people have to start co-parenting in that situation. Now, that's a word we hear a lot, and you're a co-parenting coach. So I'd really like to hear from you about what is co-parenting and what do you do as a coach to support and help people in this situation?
Great question, thank you. So co-parenting is really cooperative parenting. It's working together with your child's other parent to keep bringing up your kids together. So when you separate, you're still 2 parents with your children or your child, and that doesn't change. So it's about how you manage that process. Cooperative parenting, good communication, all the co's are definitely there. And what it's not about an equal division of time. It can be, but that's not the focus of it. The focus of it is on making sure that your kids grow up with what I call a parental loop, a co-parental loop, to really focus in on keeping them nice and safe and stable. And parents do that through communicating well, making decisions about their kids together, and being able to discuss things that are going on in their children's lives. And that gives a child the impression and the reality that their parents can still parent them. They can still do this. And as a coach, my job is to take parents through a specific methodology that we run at the Co-Parent Way. And that is really about helping them to manage some of those strong emotions that we feel after divorce and separation, and really to be able to kind of put them to one side, not to get rid of them, but just to put them to one side so that they can communicate well with each other. And we teach them how to de-escalate conflict. We teach them how to use language that's not inflammatory, how to make durable decisions together and manage some of those things in that process.
So, but what about 2 parents who have fundamental differences in the way that they want to bring up their children? I mean, they've got divorced for a reason. Their values have changed, maybe they've grown apart. So why is it so bad if you have 2 children in 2 different households and they're brought up slightly differently and the parents don't have to communicate substantively? Isn't that going to be better? So isn't there going to be less arguments in that way?
Well, I think what you're describing is parallel parenting, and usually that comes into play when there's a lot of conflict, when it's extremely high, and when that conflict is actually toxic for children and toxic for the parents to be in. And what you need to you need to get to is really a place where they can communicate and have some central rules, central boundaries, central things, central ways that they can bring up their children by. And if children have that, then they get this sense that they have the same things roughly going on in both houses. But it doesn't need to be exactly the same. Like, none of us are
it couldn't be,
perfect.
could it? It couldn't be exactly the
Exactly.
same. It's not a reality.
No. So my son, for instance, he lives between two houses.
Sure.
And we have central rules, central boundaries around, around screen time, around homework, those kinds of things. But actually, if he goes to bed at an hour later in his dad's house than he does in my house, the world isn't going to end.
So when you say central boundaries, so you and your ex-partner have agreed these, and then that's what you try and work towards?
So yes, when we got divorced, we put in place some central things that we both agreed on that we felt were really important, and we worked towards those. And obviously now he's older, that becomes more flexible. But if parents can get to a place where they can decide the things that really matter, the things that are really fundamental to them, and start from that point, and then not worry so much about the tiny things on the outside, that can really help with reducing some of the conflict that you see in the space.
I like that. Fundamental boundaries. Start with the basics. Phil, if I can come to you now. So as a family lawyer, you work in this space all the time. So you are giving advice and supporting families who are struggling with co-parent during divorce and post-divorce. So does the answer lie with the law, and how do you advise your clients around this space, legally as well as practically?
It's a combination of factors, and of which the law is just one part. For me, getting legal advice as early as possible is the key, and that applies to any issue at the start of a relationship breakdown or a separation. Once you've got that advice, you're then aware of what your legal position is, and you can use that throughout the separation journey. Do your research, find a good lawyer. There are loads of lawyers out there, but find a specialist that can really help you in the area that you need. And when you do your research, speak to friends and family. Have they been through something similar? Who did they use? Were they any good? Because a really good lawyer at that initial meeting can answer most, if not all, of the questions that you're likely to have about what life after a separation will look like. In terms of how the law fits into that, I always say the law provides a framework and almost the building blocks for how parents can then use that to find a workable solution for the arrangements for their children. Things aren't necessarily set in stone, and it is about those building blocks that the law helps you to come up with those workable solutions. One thing that I'm often asked is, what are my rights as a parent? Well, actually, it's not the parents that have the rights. Parents have very limited rights, if anything, when it comes to parenting their children. It's the child's right to have a relationship with both the parents, and that's a message that I try to convey to my clients when I'm asked that question.
Which must be frustrating for a parent. They would think, well, this is my
Yes.
child. They're a minor.
Yes.
They're young. I need to have rights to be able to manage this situation.
You're right, but the best advice that I can give my clients is to say, put yourself in your children's shoes. What are they likely to be experiencing? How can I make life easier for my child? Using those building blocks, using that early legal advice that I've had. I think one of the things that I always try and use as a real life example is the child who is in the nativity play at school or the school concert. What you don't want is, after that concert is finished, is for the child to look into the audience and see mum on one side, dad on the other, and not know what to do. So put yourself in the shoes of the child. What is going to be in that child's best interest? Seeing your parents with minimum conflict, even if that's just a united front for the benefit of the child, is going to be the best way to deal with it.
Sure. And then when we think about children in this scenario, and you've talked a lot there about the feelings and the thoughts, and think about how your children feel, which is key, isn't it? The children haven't divorced anybody. They haven't chosen a divorce. They're not divorcing their parents. So it's interesting, isn't it? As a child, we have an expectation, post-divorce that they're going to live in two households. Now, as an adult, I can't think of anything worse to make sure I've got my work bag and everything I need in both houses. So for a child, PE kit, lunchbox, lunch money, I mean, that seems so incredibly difficult. How do we square that circle? And does the law give us a magic bullet to deal with that?
You're absolutely right. And a cliche that I often use is, whilst you might be divorcing as husband and wife, you're not divorcing as parents. You're never going to be able to do that. Does the law give you a magic bullet? No, it doesn't. Flexibility, I would say, is the key. Communication, really. Communication, flexibility and compromise. Those are the three pinnacles that I think every parent should have at the forefront of their mind when trying to make arrangements work for their children.
Joanna, let me bring you into this. I can imagine there are many parents listening and watching today and just thinking, the lawyers and the law just caused me problems. They made it worse. They'd go far to say as they hindered the situation. Now, we've heard already that it's about communication. Communication is where you really come in. So isn't it right that we should just come and look at mediation in the first instance? Isn't that the forum? Isn't it mediators where we should start, begin and end when we're thinking about the co-parenting journey and how they manage this after divorce?
There is now an expectation that people will mediate. It's not compulsory, but there have been changes that have come in since April this year in the family arena, which enable a judge to send a case back out of court for mediation or other forms of non-court dispute resolution, to really try to make people reflect a bit more about different ways that they might be able to resolve their issues. A judge can also potentially make a costs order against someone that's been obstructive to mediation. So there is now systemically an underpinning of that being a key part of the process. And the reason for that is kind of twofold. One is the courts are overloaded. So it's like, how do we manage caseloads? How do we make sure that families aren't going through a situation, a process that goes on for months, potentially years? So there's sort of an expediting of that. And there are practical ways of getting your divorce managed more quickly in that regard. So there are different ways that you can have a private scenario basically versus a court one. Mediation is sort of different in that regard, in that it is quicker, it is cheaper, but it's also very much about, as you say, the communication and the conversation. And a phrase that I heard recently when I was talking to somebody about how it all works and the changes, the cultural changes in family practice, are that it's very much taking the family into a psychologically informed environment. It's not therapy, mediation, but it's kind of therapeutic is what I always say to the clients.
Sure.
So they come in, they do need to communicate. They've got a shared problem, which is they've got assets that need to be divided. They need to work out what's going to happen with the children, but it's deeply personal at that point. They are in a time of huge uncertainty, fear. You already mentioned the thought of not waking up and seeing your children every day, Christmas, all these things. It's huge. You don't know what the future is going to look like. But how do you have that conversation well? How do you get that communication going? So I always see the role of the mediator as being fundamental in sort of guiding people in being able to listen to the other person, because everybody wants to be heard. They just believe that they've got the best idea. The other person just needs to kind of get with the program. But it's like, you're both feeling equally strongly about that. So what you need to be able to do is to speak as well as you can. And that's the role of the mediator, supporting people coming from their sort of the best place that they can, which can be very hard when you're just feeling frustrated and confused, and also supporting and understanding that you need to listen to the other person.
And how do you do that? If one person might be more dominant in that situation, I'm sure the listeners will be thinking, well, I just couldn't do that. They'll think about their spouse and they'll think, well, that person will just talk a lot and I won't be able to do that. How do you bring out their voice in mediation?
Yeah. So for a start, I have exactly the same conversation with each of them separately, which is the kind of priming about the importance of listening, and that listening to the other person is not agreeing. So you sort of, you set those basic boundaries. I would make sure that you're sort of giving equal airtime to both. And you just need to do that bluntly by sometimes cutting across, by also making sure that sometimes the person that says less can say something really meaningful that can be completely ignored by the other person. They just want to go straight back into the, well, this is what you think. And I'll sort of slow the process down effectively by then making that point be actually properly heard. Oh, did you hear what they just said? How did that make you feel? Because what I heard was they're acknowledging the difficulties for you. And that is a really interesting element that, we all have in our lives all the time. We make assumptions about why someone else is doing something, why someone else has said something. And when you kind of put it a bit under the magnifying glass in the mediation environment, you can quite quickly often get to a stage where someone's saying, I had no idea that's where you were coming from, that's how you were seeing it. Not always. Sometimes people really are not able to sit back and to be able to have that reflection. But that, for me, is the power of mediation. It's about an environment where people can reflect, they can listen without a fear of being pinned down to a position. It's confidential, so you can't go away afterwards and say, well, this is exactly what you agreed. It's just about the conversation, and it's, hopefully in that safe environment. And the mediator's role isn't to say, haha, you've just said something that means that you're wrong. It's like, well, why did you say that? Why do you think that? And it's
a safe space.
Exploring, it's a safe space. Yeah.
Yeah, and it sounds interesting as well, because don't you find sometimes that clients might think, oh no, this is never going to work. I'm coming, but it's never going to work. But we see it does work. It really, really can work. And there can be that moment of realisation whereby they stop and reflect, and it can make a change of direction in the co-parenting theme.
Yeah.
Phil, I just want to pick up on something that Joanna said with you there. Mm-hmm. Mediation, there's an expectation that everybody should do it.
That's right.
So what do your clients feel in that space about being forced to do something that perhaps they don't want to do?
Well, as Joanna said, it's not compulsory, but new court rules that have come into place set out very high expectations that people are expected to mediate and consider other forms of non-court dispute resolution, whether that be arbitration, early neutral evaluation, all forms of alternative non-court dispute resolution.
Which is
option.
Really to avoid court, isn't it? To avoid going into a court process.
And actually, from a legal point of view, the courts say, we are not the best forum to resolve your parenting disputes. We would much rather that as parents, you sort this out outside the court arena. Because the way I explain it to my clients is, do you want the autonomy to make decisions for your children? Or do you want a complete stranger, a judge, to impose a decision on you that neither of you may like?
Sure.
And I think if you ask the majority of people, they would all agree that they would want that autonomy.
And like Joanna said, the common ground is that it's a shared problem. So maybe a shared solution is the way forward.
Absolutely.
Marcie, coming back to you. One of the things that I've heard can be really positive and powerful in co-parenting is being positive about the other parent, particularly in front of the children. Now, I'm sure there are some parents listening today to say, I just can't do that. And I can't do it because I don't feel it and it won't be authentic. So is it crucial? Why and how do you do it if you're not feeling it?
It is crucial. It is absolutely crucial for your children to see you being able to have a conversation, respectfully. Doesn't need to be massively genuine. It just needs to appear that it is genuine. And by doing that, you're upholding that loop that I was talking about earlier. It's not easy, though. You've got parents who are in very high states of emotion. They're in conflict. They've got noise coming in from the outside, friends, family saying, oh, you shouldn't be doing that and you shouldn't be doing this. And it's like, it can be just a very unpleasant scenario to try and do that in. However, if you can think longer term, so think forward to when your kids are about in their 20s, what do you want them to say about how they were parented during your separation? What do you want them to say about how it made them feel? Do you want your kids to say, it was terrible, I still need therapy now, I've got massive problems forming relationships? Or do you want your kids to go, actually, well, it was good enough. It wasn't ideal, but my parents did everything they could to make me feel nice and safe and secure.
And I was in two happy households as opposed to one difficult, oppressive household.
Definitely. And if it's the case that it's the latter, if it's the case where you want your child to say, actually, it was good enough, what is it that you need to do now as a parent who doesn't massively want to be polite to their ex? What is it that you need to do now to make that happen in the future? Probably you can take small steps, like saying hello at pickups and drop-offs, okay? Being respectful.
Making some eye contact.
Yeah, not rolling your eyes.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Those kinds of things make a massive difference. And they're small steps, right? We can only start by taking one step. So take the first step. What is it that you can do today to make that long-term vision that you want for your children happen?
And I suppose it's also thinking, particularly if they're young, graduations, weddings. You want to be there, both of you. You should both be there.
Zahra, you're probably going to be co-grandparents with this person, right? So it's a long-term game that we're in. So it's really important to remember that.
Okay, great. Phil, coming back to you. As you said, we want to stay out of the court arena if we can. But some people need court intervention for whatever reason, and it's no criticism of any parent who needs the support, help and guidance of the law and the court system. But you go through the court system and you get a court order, which is a piece of paper where a judge has said, this is what I expect to happen now. This is what the court, the law of this land is ordering. But it's a piece of paper. If somebody doesn't adhere to it, somebody doesn't play by the rules on that piece of paper, does it have any teeth? What's the point? What can you do with that piece of paper?
It's a good question. I think there's potentially two different scenarios here, if I can address each of those. I think we're all parents here, and I think we'd probably all agree that children need things at different stages of their life. As toddlers, we as parents are caregivers. When they get older, I don't know about you, but I feel more like an Uber service to my children.
And a bank.
And a bank, absolutely. So it may be that in that situation, there's been a court order that's been around for many years sometimes, and it's just not working. And I think having the ability to discuss with the other parent why it's not working, looking at alternatives, being flexible, and possibly having to vary that order in legitimate circumstances to make it work again. That's one scenario. Contrast that with another scenario where a judge has been very specific about a court order and putting arrangements in place which regulate a child's contact with one of the parents. And that might be to prioritise that parent's relationship with the child. But what you've got is the other parent frustrating that contact and sometimes going to extreme examples, doing everything possible to alienate the other parent. That's a very different scenario. And in that situation, the court order will have teeth and you can apply back to court to enforce that order. And in some extreme examples, the court can consider transferring residence so that one parent can promote contact with the other parent, which might not be happening.
And by residence, you mean the parent who the
child spends the majority of time
Right.
living with. Yes.
Right, okay. So in some extreme circumstances, it can work, and it's important to take some advice around that space.
Absolutely. It's like the point I made right at the start. Get advice. There's some great resources out there. If cost's an issue, there are places where you can go for free legal advice. A lot of firms of solicitors will offer a free consultation, citizens' advice. Many resources out there, but just get that early advice.
Yeah, because knowledge is power. So if you've got the knowledge, and then you can think about your child's rights and how you pursue what is right for them. Staying on that theme about the child, Joanna, how do you know in a mediation space when you're talking to mum and dad, they're telling you about what the children need or want or what they believe they need or want? How do you actually focus on the child's voice and the child's wishes and feelings? How do you get to the bottom of that? Is that even possible in mediation?
There is child-inclusive mediation, which involves a specialist child mediator who can have conversations with child or children. The sort of generally accepted age for that is 10 and up, but if there is a group of siblings and there are younger siblings than 10 in the mix, they would also get to speak to the mediator, because it is important that all the children feel like they're being treated equally. Now, the reason for child inclusive mediation becoming more of a thing is because where children don't get to speak in this scenario where they're not making any choices, there's a lot of research that shows that later on that disempowerment has big effects later. So sometimes the parents will be like, no, they're absolutely fine, but the children aren't necessarily speaking up. So it's just really important that they have that opportunity. Yes, we would like a mediator to speak to the children. Children don't want to do it. It might be also that they do want to do it, but they don't necessarily want anything to be fed back to the parents. That's totally up to them. And then again, they could say, yeah, this is exactly what I want you to tell my parents. And of course, that's then a really powerful thing for the parents to be able to hear.
It's great, isn't it? Because it potentially, if it's the right thing in that right situation, it gives it a different dimension.
It does.
And it might help you get to a solution and a positive co-parenting, communicative piece quicker, potentially.
And sometimes a real concern that parents will have about it is we don't want to put the burden on the children. We don't want them to feel that they're responsible. And that is a really important thing to weigh up. And again, all children will be different. Some will be desperate to be able to be heard. Some will not necessarily, and they'll be wanting their parents to take that lead together.
Phil, staying on this theme of the voice of the child, from a purely legal point of view, within the law and that arena, how do you get to grips with the voice of the child? Are the children heard in that arena as well as the mediation arena?
They can be, yes. So when I mentioned at the start this framework that exists in the law, that talks about guiding principles that courts, if it ever gets to that stage, have to take into account. So, for example, the age of the child's educational needs, any other special needs that they have, the ability of the parents to care for the child. One of the things on that list is the child's wishes and feelings in light of their age and understanding, and that's absolutely something that the courts can take into account. The courts would involve specialist professionals who can talk to children in that situation and give them a voice and report that voice, what the children are feeling, back to court, so that that can then be taken into account by the judge when looking at what the appropriate arrangement should be.
That's really helpful, thank you. Marcie, bringing you into the conversation again, let's talk about introducing new partners. That can be one of the most emotive things that happens. Now, I know I've seen that you blog about this, and I'm sure you deal with it in your book as well. So it'd be really interesting to hear about your book and this specific piece of new partners, which can be so traumatic for the children, for the other spouse.
So it really is. It's one of those massive, I call it a hot topic, and it's one of those triggering things because suddenly you have another adult in your child's life that is potentially taking on a parental role, and that can feel really, really threatening to you, right? So step parents, new partners, the whole range is, it can be really tricky. It can be a really tricky time. The thing is, you need to come back again to this idea of long-term, short-term versus long-term. So if you don't like the new partner, or if you're feeling a bit jealous or a little bit uncomfortable, just have a think, have a look and ask yourself the question, what does my child think of them? If your kid likes them, brilliant. That's really good, because actually what you're going for is your child having a good relationship with all the people in their life, not just you and not just their other parent, right? It doesn't need to be exclusive. There's enough love to go around. You won't ever be replaced as a parent because you're the biological parent. It's about the quality time that you spend with your child. So even if your child is at their other house 5 days a week and you're only seeing them every other weekend or every weekend, make sure that you have really good quality time with your child. So that becomes like a very rich experience for your child. Doesn't matter then if they're seeing the other person in their life, more than you. So it's just really focus on that. Introducing new partners, that's always tricky as well. We deal with that in the book. I'll tell you about the book in a minute. But the idea of introducing someone needs to be slow, right? You can't just dump a new person into your child's life and expect them to love them and be interested in them just as much as you can. Do it by stages, step by step. All of this is a long marathon, right? So you don't just turn up to a marathon and start running. You train for it, okay? Same for your children. They need to know about the person that's coming into their life. They need to meet them slowly, probably in a neutral environment, maybe in a park. Outdoors is quite good because it helps us feel very, very grounded. And then, moving up towards lunch, something longer before you're thinking about overnight stays. If I had a magic wand and could paint the ideal picture, that's what it would look like. Of course,
and who knows first? Should you tell the child first or the other parent first?
The other parent. You have to be respectful, right? You're still, as you very eloquently said, parenting them together. And, you don't divorce as parents. You can't. So you need to be respectful. Tell them that you've met someone. It's not up to that person to tell your child that mum's got a new partner, mum's got a new boyfriend. You tell your child, but you have to be inclusive.
That's really helpful. Phil, I'm sure your clients ask you about this space as well, about new partners. What do you advise?
It's a really tricky issue, isn't it? And as you say, so emotive. I think as parents, we all want to raise happy, healthy children who are secure, and we want to give them the tools to be able to go on to form healthy relationships of their own. And I think one of those tools is showing them what a happy, healthy relationship looks like. So for me, it's not necessarily about timing of new relationship, it's about quality of new relationship. Of course, there's always those scenarios where a new partner has already been introduced, the communication wasn't there, as Marcie was saying, it should be. In that situation, it's sad because it's a case of trying to lock the stable door after the horse has already bolted. But I think if listeners could take from this, communication is the key and respect, as Marcie quite rightly said.
What if somebody says, no, that's not acceptable. That person cannot meet my children. I'm not interested in that person. It's not the right person.
I think you'd need to look at the reasons why they were saying that. From a welfare and safeguarding perspective, there may be genuine concerns, and that's something that a court would necessarily have to get involved in. But absent those reasons, there is no legitimate reason why a partner shouldn't go on to have a new relationship.
But the key to making it successful is clearly that communication and that conversation in the first instance.
Yes, absolutely.
Highlighting it rather than just bouncing somebody in.
It can feel quite threatening though,
Of course.
It really can, and that can put you as a parent in high alert. That's my child and I'm not going to be seeing them. So the other thing to add in, I think, is around how do you manage some of those strong emotions that you're feeling, and what is it that you can do to look after yourself enough so you can show up to these conversations and not feel like you're overwhelmed and in a kind of potentially in a fight-flight response.
Absolutely. Does this come up in mediation, Joanna? Do people bring it up to say, well, I want to introduce somebody, and do they kind of land it in mediation to say, I've met somebody and I want to do this?
I haven't had that yet. It's been more what Phil was saying about the situation where there are other partners already in the mix, and on that you get the full range. Sometimes it's lovely and you hear people saying, I love the fact that my ex-partner's got this partner in their lives because I know it's another good parent for my children.
Wow, that's amazing. So people say that is really powerful stuff.
It's really powerful. And again, I was saying earlier about how important it is to acknowledge the good stuff that gets said in a mediation, and that it's always important to acknowledge that is a really lovely situation for everyone to be in, great for the children, very child-focused. And again, in those situations, you might have that they've already established a good communications dynamic with all of the key figures in that child's life being on a communications group like WhatsApp or whatever. But then you have others where a new partner does seem to be part of a problematic dynamic. And again, it's the sort of power of mediation is supporting the self-reflection and supporting through questioning why it is that that's a problem. Is it because of a fear of loss, or is it something more significant and it is about a safeguarding issue for a child? And if it is about a safeguarding issue for a child, then it's often that's the point at which it's not perhaps appropriate for mediation, because that's where you need to, if other agencies are involved, That's one thing.
I think one of the great things about mediation is the mediator can use it to address situations that aren't necessarily live. Yes. So you could have a really great mediation, almost a textbook, and then at the end you can say, have you thought about what might happen when one of you wants to introduce a new partner? And they might not have done. They might think, okay, well, we're okay with that. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But the beauty of mediation, and what I think is perfect, is that you can say, okay, well, we're in a safe space now. Let's have that conversation. While we're all together, while we're in this managed environment, let's have that conversation so that we can deal with it.
It's really good, isn't it? Because you're looking to the future, aren't you? Which is great for this journey through divorce and looking at life after divorce. Trying to look into the future a little bit can be potentially great. And actually, hopefully, some of the conflict can de-escalate because you're now in two households. You've got a bit more space. You feel a bit more comfortable. But even in that scenario, we're all saying that having some sort of agreement or having some sort of plan and some positive communication is the way forward. So you took flexibility and you need some leniency. So Marcie, coming to you on that point, those two things can be quite tricky to balance because everybody's relying on this agreement, whether it's a court order, whether it's something in writing or not in writing, whether it's something that's been discussed in mediation. So you have this agreement and this is your plan and you really, really, really rely on it. But things happen. People get ill. You have a problem at work. You have to stay late. The car breaks down. And the other person can get really frustrated with that. So how do parents manage that balance of flexibility and consistency? Consistency being so important for children.
Consistency super important, and actually as long as you're kind of mostly sticking to your plan, to your court order, to your co-parenting plan, that's good. Then I think parents can be comfortable with the idea of being a bit flexible if they need to be. Having your agreement, something about when times get tough, or if my car breaks down, or if I have to travel with work, this is what we'll do. So thinking forward and having a plan for those moments that's written down is also really helpful because you've already had the conversation then, you've already agreed it. It's not in the heat of the moment.
And tell me a little bit more about your book then in terms of how you deal with situations of either conflict or other aspects of this co-parenting piece.
So the book's a 6-step process to raising happy and resilient kids after
wow,
divorce.
6 steps only.
Yeah,
I mean, that's incredible.
6 steps.
Okay.
They're quite long steps, but
Yeah.
6 steps. And it moves from, this idea of a long-term vision to being able to manage strong emotions, to being able to see things from each other's other perspectives and set boundaries, which is really, really important. We were talking about that before. And then communication, de-escalating that conflict, not using inflammatory language, and then being able to use all of that to make durable decisions together. What is it that your children need? They need you to still parent together. And then moving really into the best bit, which is going from beyond surviving into thriving, which is really important.
It is, and I think, we're talking about a lot of the problems and difficulties, which is the right thing for this topic, but you can get there. If you work at it, you can get there, and I think that's a really important message. So, Phil, parents, they're individuals, they're people. They're not just mum and dad. They are people in their own right. They have needs, they have thoughts, they have feelings. Your clients come to you and they come for legal help, but it's more than that, isn't it? There are other ways that these individual people need support. What kind of support do you offer them, or what do you tell them about that's out there?
It's so important that people do have support. I mean, let's be honest, going through a separation and a divorce is not easy. It's incredibly challenging. I think everyone would probably agree here. But having that support is crucial, whether it be from friends and family, your GP, other professionals who can help provide any support that you need. Yes, lawyers can give legal advice, and quite often they will be a listening ear, but we are not professionally trained as counsellors.
But it is part of your job. It's part
absolutely
of the role.
part of the role. It is absolutely
because clients
part of the role.
lean on you in that way.
They do. I try and bring in other experts to manage that. So, for example, we're very lucky here at Owen Mitchell. We have a counsellor that is a service that we offer to our clients who need that additional support. But there's other professional services as well that people can lean on. There's some great resources out there to help parents manage with conflict. There's some parenting apps. Marcie mentioned about tone when communicating. Some of the apps have tone monitors. So they
wow,
can,
I didn't know that. Actual tone monitors.
Absolutely.
So you can
So
kind of practice how you're talking and how it's
You can
going to
type
be
a
received.
message and
Wow.
it might say, this sounds a bit
Aggressive.
Yeah, you might want to think about how this is perceived and therefore you might want to change it. So yeah, really great resources out there.
And I think it's important, isn't it, to know you're not alone.
You're not alone. Loads of people go through this. You will have had friends and family who've been through it. Use them as a support.
I'm going to bring this into land now, so I'm going to ask you all really one piece of advice or thought, something that our listeners should take away with them that could help benefit them and help them on this journey of co-parenting post-divorce. Joanna, can I come to you first?
Be open-minded. Always think about the children at the centre of everything. Be aware of where you're struggling and understanding that you want to do the best that you can to get through this situation so that you can get to a stage where your energy is being focused on living a good life, not being stuck in the fight.
To live your best life, I think. To live your best life, even though you've gone through this awful process, but to live your best life with your children.
Absolutely.
It's almost like another opportunity, isn't it? To start again and do it differently.
Yeah.
And make it work. That's great. Thank you. Phil, coming to you with the same question, a real takeaway for the listeners today who are going through perhaps a traumatic time right now.
I'm going to go right back to the beginning where I first started and say, get some early legal advice, because that will really dictate the direction of travel as to how you then deal with things. Put yourself in your children's shoes, see how they would view the situation. It's enshrined in law that any decisions have to be in the child's best interests. So really bear that in mind when making any decisions on their behalf.
And I think always remembering, that to the credit of the parents, it's the children who were amazing.
Absolutely.
And they made these amazing children together. They loved each other at the beginning and they can still have a really positive co-parenting relationship.
Absolutely. And picking up on something that Joanna said, your choice of lawyer is so important. So me and my colleagues at Irwin Mitchell, we will always try and resolve any conflict situation in the most constructive and amicable way, in the best interests of the wider family.
And it can be done.
That's
the reality. And you see it done.
Yes, day in, day out.
Yeah, which is good. Marcie, one takeaway for our listeners today, going as they're navigating their way through this journey.
I think it's everything that Joanna and Phil have said, and it's also about choice. We have a choice as individuals as to how we are going to go through our separation and divorce. We have a choice about how we're going to behave. We have a choice that we can put our children front and centre always when we're making a decision. And we have a choice about how we look after ourselves to ensure we get to thriving. Choose wisely, get early intervention, get help, get mediation, get a good lawyer, read my book, read other books. There are loads of really fantastic resources out there, and make a positive choice.
Thank you so much for such an interesting discussion and for sharing your stories and advice with us. And thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in again. We've been talking about life after divorce and what that looks like on the co-parenting journey. In the second part of our episode, we'll be talking about the finances and how you cope with finances during that journey of life after divorce and how you protect yourselves and your family for the future. Hit that subscribe button so that you don't miss out on further episodes. Thank you so much for joining. Take care and goodbye.